What is happening, everybody? Welcome back to my channel. I'm very excited to show you how to use React server components in Next.js by building a grocery tracking app. Firstly, I'll be showing you an existing app that does not use React server components, and then we will dive deeper into how to convert that app to use React server components for better performance. And make sure to watch this video till the end because I'll be giving my take on whether you should use React server components or not. So without wasting any more time, let's get into it. Now, before we dive deeper into how React server components work, let's first understand why do they exist in the first place. Now, in order to do that, we have to understand what are different rendering techniques in React.js. So number one that we have on the list is client-side rendering. And this is what most of the React apps used to have when React initially came out. The way it works is your client or your browser will make a request to the server, and then server will return an HTML blank page with the link to JavaScript bundle. So browser will render your HTML page, and then it'll come to that JavaScript bundle link, and then it'll go back to the server, download that JavaScript and run that JavaScript. And then eventually that JavaScript will render all your React components. Now this technique was fine, but there were a lot of problems around. Now, as you can see, there are a lot of steps involved before the end user finally sees something on the screen. That itself is a huge problem. But another big problem with this method was SEO, because web crawlers will also load your app and they will also be seeing a blank screen. So it's bad for SEO because there's nothing to see for the web crawler. And that's pretty much it for client-side rendering. Now, another method that we have on our list is called server-side rendering. And the way it works is your client will make a request to the server will return HTML page with a link to JavaScript bundle. The only difference is in this technique, that HTML page will not be empty. It will have some kind of a loading screen. So once your browser receives that HTML page which has a loading screen, it will finally go ahead and download this JavaScript bundle from the server, and then that bundle basically contains all your React code, and then React will replace that loading screen with the actual React component. Now this was all great, but developers used to run a lot into hydration errors. Hydration is basically when the browser receives that initial HTML page with the React components. That process of replacing the loading screen with React components is called hydration. And developers used to run a lot into these hydration errors because whatever is pre-rendered on the page which is sent to the browser, that is what React should also render initially. So there is something to compare against. But let's say if those two, pre-rendered page and the React's initial render, do not match, React used to throw a hydration error. So that was a big issue among developers. But overall, this technique was way better than simply client-side rendering your whole app. And at last, we have React server components. Now, how do server components work? Let's dig deeper into this. We have a browser and then we have a server. Browser makes a request to the server. This time, what will happen is this server will render certain parts of your app on the server side and then ship those to the client. What do I mean by that? So let's say this is the page that server returns, and we have certain server components that are rendered on the server side. So what will happen is we will make call to our DB or whatever on the server side, will render all these components. But these components might also have some interactive components like a button, for example. So let's add those as well. So let's say these are buttons. Now, if you think about it, these buttons will have some kind of a click event on it, but there is no click on the server. So the way this works is your browser will download this entire page, but not these interactive components. Your server components, these blocks, will have a reference to the JS bundle, which will eventually render these interactive components. This is the main concept to understand about React server components. I have seen a lot of videos or a lot of blogs where they call it server components and client components, but I think instead of that, we should just call it server components and interactive components. Interactive components are basically that require some kind of a event listening or React state. Now you might be wondering, like, what is the benefit of this? Server-side rendering can also render on. The main benefit of this is, first, you will have you do not have to show that loading screen. You can render your entire page with all the server components and then send it to the client. Whereas in server-side rendering, you will have to show the loading screen initially. Whereas with server components, you can actually show the content. And the second benefit is in server-side rendering, you will still have to ship all the JavaScript bundle to basically replace that loading screen with the React components. Whereas in server components, we have already rendered all these components on the server side. So we do not need that JavaScript to replace these components. That means we'll have smaller JavaScript bundles. That itself will increase your app loading speed. So what will happen is these components will get rendered on the server, but they will have links or references to the JavaScript bundles that it will eventually load these interactive components. And that's how server components work. And I know in theory it might be confusing, but let me now show you that grocery tracking app that I was talking about in the beginning of this video, and things will be a lot more clearer. So let's move on. So let's look at the app that we will be converting to use React server components. So this is what the app looks like. It's pretty simple. This is the home page and it just has this create new grocery list button. We will not go into the details of which UI library I'm using. If you still want to know, I'm just using Tailwind CSS along with Shad CN. So this has this create new grocery list button. When I click on this button, it will make an API call to the server to create a new grocery list. Let me also open a network tab so you can see the API calls going out. Let me zoom out. So when I click on this and it created this list and I got redirected to that list. Let me add new tomatoes, can hit enter, apples, oranges. So this is how you can create a list, and you have this share list button as well. Clicking on that will copy the URL of this list to the clipboard, and I can go to another tab and paste the URL and it'll load the list for me. Now this app is not using server components at all. So let me show you the implementation of this app. So we have this app directory. This is typical Next.js project. We have app directory, and inside that app directory I have layout.jsx and page.jsx. So let's look at what is inside page.jsx. So if you see here, this is the button that we saw initially on the home page of this app to create a new grocery list. Now what is this button doing? This button is calling this create new grocery list function. So let's open. This function is basically setting the state. It makes a call to this API and then creates a new list, and then we basically redirect the user to that page. Pretty simple. But if you see here, I'm using use client directive in Next.js. The reason for doing that is I want this to be an interactive component. So by default in Next.js 13 and onwards, every component is a server component. And in order to tell Next.js that you want this to be a client component, you have to use this directive and just add it at the top of your file, and this will act as an interactive component now. So let me create another list. I'll click on this, and now let's go to the individual list page. So I have this path. If you want to know more about the folder structure in Next.js, let me know in the comments below. I can create a video on that. And let's look at the page.jsx of this. So we have use params is basically to get the list ID. So if you see the square brackets around this list ID, this is by intention. Next.js has this naming convention that if you want certain attribute to be dynamic, you can wrap that in square brackets. I will not go into the naming of the folders and files in Next.js. That's whole another video. But this list ID is dynamic, and based on this list ID, we will basically fetch all the items. So let's look at how is this working. So initially what will happen is if there is no grocery list. Now what a grocery list is basically the state variable that we have. If there is no grocery list, we will simply show a loading screen, as you can see here. In order to show this, let me throttle these requests. So I'll select slow 3G and now refresh, and there you go. That is your loading screen. So what happened is our browser made a request to the server. So server is rendering this shell on the server side and sending it back to the client. On the client side, we will make another request to the server to get all the grocery list items, and then we will re-render the list again. So as soon as we get the response back from the server, we will render our list. And there you go. Let me switch to no throttling. And there is some other functionality in this app as well. For example, you can mark this after, let's say you buy these items, you can mark these as bought, you can unmark these, and you can also delete the items, right? And the best part about this is this share list. You can click on this, it'll copy the URL and you can paste it in or send it to someone. And that's pretty much it, how it's implemented using client components. Now there are certain problems with this. Let's look at those problems. So problem number one that you have already seen, it's not really a problem, but it's from user perspective. It's not that good. So if I switch it to slow 3G and I refresh, you will see as a user, I'm seeing this loading screen. Why? My browser is making an API call to fetch the data from the server. Now this is okay, but we can do better than that. So now let's go ahead and convert our app to use server components, and you will see what huge difference it makes. Now before we start converting this app into server components, and for any app that you want to build using server components, one of the most important things you have to do in the beginning of your project is identify what components will be server components and what components will be interactive components. So if we see here, let me go back to the home page. Now this is simply a button, and button obviously I will want to be interactive. So on this page, entire thing has to be interactive. So I will use this as client. So if I go here and I have this use client for this page, I'll keep it as it is. So we'll leave this. But if I go to the list page, and let me just create another list. Now on the list page, let's examine what are interactive components and what can be rendered on the server. Now if you see this whole thing which has an input and a button, now obviously this is an interactive component. So that is our one interactive component that we have to separate out from the rest of this component. And then if we see these bars that render our list items, we have these checkbox and this bin icon. These two are also interactive. So we have to separate these out into a client component, and then we have share list component at the bottom, which is obviously a client component. So let's go ahead and start converting these into interactive components or server components one by one. So the first thing that I want to do is get rid of this use client directive. And you will see as soon as I removed it, I started getting all these errors, but that's fine. I'll go ahead and hit save, and you will see I started getting this error. The error says you are importing a component that needs use state. It only works in client component, but none of its parent are marked with use client. So they are a server components by default. So now this is officially a server components. That means there is no interactivity here. So I'll have to get rid of the state or any of the use effects that I'm using or any event listeners that I have. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'll get rid of this, and I cannot have use effect, and I have to get rid of all these because I cannot use any hooks. Get rid of those as well. I know it's a bit weird to get rid of all the state related stuff because that's what React is known for. And last, we have to remove all our client components or interactive components that will be separating out later. So the first one that I have is this one. I'll comment it out. This is the input with the button. And then the second one I have is this div. This div is the share list button. So we have this grocery list variable, but we do not have that anymore. So we will get rid of that as well. So I'll take this entire thing, I'll cut it and I'll paste it outside. Cool. So now what is the first thing that we need here? List of items or list of groceries, right? What we'll do now is, now that this is a server component, that means this will get rendered on the server, and the JavaScript for this will not even get pushed to the client. So what we can do is we can import our MongoDB and all our models here. So what I'll do here is I'll import connect Mongo function, and I'll also import my grocery list model. There you go. So the next thing that we want to do is we want to basically call this function to connect to our DB. So let's go ahead and do that. So we are getting an error that, oh, await can only be used with async. So let's go ahead and add async in front of this function. So here we are basically connecting to our DB. Awesome. So once we do connect to our DB, the next thing that we want to do is we want to fetch the list of groceries. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'll do grocery list await grocery.find one with the list ID. So how are we going to get this list ID? Component in Next.js, it gets this params props, which will give us that list ID that we need. So now that we have this list ID, we can fetch our grocery list. Awesome. Another thing that we want to ensure is if there is no grocery list, because sometimes there can be scenario where users can enter invalid ID in the URL. We want to make sure we handle that case. So we'll just return no list found. Awesome. And then the next thing that I want to do is I want to pass this grocery list items that I get in this sort items function that I added to basically sort items based on whether they are marked as bought or not. So I'll do sorted items is equal to sort. So now we get our sorted items. So what I'll do is I'll simply, instead of this, I'll replace this with sorted items. I'll get rid of this and hit save, and there you go. And now we are rendering our list. If you pay attention, what I've done here is I've connected to my DB in the React component, and I'm basically making DB calls right in the component. Now I can do that because I know that JavaScript for this component will not get shipped to the browser in production. So I have the ability to just make all the API calls I want. So I'm getting my data on the server and I'm just rendering that list here. So let's go ahead and take a look at this list item component. If we see here, this component is also a client component. So the first thing that we want to do is just get rid of this use client and hit save. Let's see what errors are we getting. And there you go. So we are getting an error saying event handlers cannot be passed to client component props. Awesome. So what do we want to do here? So let's go ahead and fix these errors. So let me first remove this set grocery list. Next thing that I want to do is I want to simply take this entire component. This component is interactive component that will mark items as bought or delete items. So let me comment these out. Hit save, and there you go. And now if you see here, this is bare minimum of what our app will render with React server components. And if we just send this to the user when the initial app loads, this will be great because user can at least see the data on the screen instead of seeing a loading screen. Now let me show you what this looks like in terms of initial load. So let me switch this to slow 3G and I'll hit refresh, and you'll see what I mean when I say initial render will be nice. And there you go. That's our app rendered with all the data. There is no loading screen. So users will get all the data on the initial load itself. Awesome. So what do we want to do next? Next, we want to bring in all our interactive components or client components. So let's go ahead and create different files for those components. First component that I really want to create is just that share list component because that is the easiest. So what I'll do here is inside components folder, I will create a new file called JSX. And this will be a client component. Awesome. For the share list button, and then import that share to from Lucid React and hit save. There's nothing that happened, but now what I can do is I can import this client component into my server component. So let's go ahead and do that. So what I'll do is share list button, and then I will get rid of this entire thing and just have share list button here. And now let me switch this, hit refresh. So the next thing that I want to do is I want to import that share list button in my main page, and I want to render that here. As soon as I hit save, you will see I'm getting a reference error saying handle share list is not defined. So let's go ahead and take this method or function that we have defined here and paste it in share list button. Awesome. And there you go. Now you see we have a mix of server and client components, and you saw how I converted that specific button into a client component and then imported that in server components. And now if I click on this, we are getting an error. Let's see what that error is. So you'll see I'm getting an error saying list ID is not defined. So what do we want to do is we want to pass list ID as a prop to this. So let's add a list ID here, and now let's test it. And there you go, it's working as expected. Awesome. So that was interactive component number 1, and that was the easiest. So now let's move on to other interactive components, which is this input and the button, meaning ability to add new items to the list. So I'll create a new component. Let's call it add new item JSX, and here let's initiate it, rename it to add. Awesome. I'll get the JSX for this. So I'll just copy this entire thing and paste it here. And then let's see what we are missing. So we are missing a plus icon. So we'll import that. Let me format this. So we are missing this handle key press function, and we are also missing this set new item setter, which will come from use state. And then I will basically new item and set new item. Awesome. And let's bring this handle key press from here, and I can also just take this handle new item along with it. So I'll just do these two. And if you now see how we are narrowing down our server component, we are slowly removing all the interactive components to their sub components, and then we are importing them back into server components. So I'll paste those two functions here, hit save, and I'll format. Awesome. And now what I want to do is I want to import that add new item component here. So I'll add new item here and hit save. As soon as I hit save, we will get this error saying you are importing component that needs use state. It works only in client. So what we have to do is we need to go back to this add new item and add use client here. Awesome. So we have added this input now. Great. Let's power this input. So what I'll do is I'll add a new item. We are getting some error in the console. Let's see. We are getting this error in the console. So this also needs a list ID here. And then let's pass list ID from this component. Now let's try hitting plus. Getting another error saying grocery list is not defined. So let's pass grocery list as well. So now we get this grocery list as well. Let's go back here. Grocery list items is not iterable. So now what we want to do is this is not an object anymore. So we can simply just do this, hit save, plus UUID is not defined. So let's import that. Now I'm getting an error saying sort items is not defined. So let's import that. Okay, so we finally have everything that I think we need. So let's try adding another one. Test 4, hit save, set groceries list is not defined. So let's just get rid of this for now. Let's see. Let me open the network tab as well and see what is going on. Test 5, hit save. If you see, our call is successful, but our UI is not getting updated. In a typical React app, you will achieve this by just updating the state and you will see the UI getting updated as well. But now this is our React server component. So how do we update the UI in this? Let me add another item, test 6. And you see the UI is not getting updated, but we know that our calls are successful. Our items are getting added to the list. So how do we update the UI for React server components? And this is one of the points where I was initially getting confused when I was learning React server components. But Next.js gives you some utilities that you can use to basically update the UI here. So what I'll do here is I'll import a hook called use router, and then I'll call that hook, and here I'll just do router.refresh. As soon as I hit save, you'll see those items showing up. Now let me add another item here. Enter, and there you go. Now our items are showing up as expected. Now you can see our page is getting refreshed and our UI is getting updated. Awesome. Now let's go ahead and add other interactive components to mark item as bought and to delete an item. Now in order to achieve that, let's go to our list item component where we have those buttons. So these are the buttons that are responsible for doing that. So let's add a new component. Let's call it list item actions.jsx. I'll initiate this, call this list item actions and list item actions. Awesome. Now let me copy this JSX and bring it here. Let's import all the required and hit save. Let's import that component now. So I'll import list item actions and I'll render it here. Hit save. We are getting errors, of course. We want to move all these handlers to that list item actions as well, because that's where they'll be used. So paste it here, hit save. Let's see. So what errors are we getting? So the first error that we are getting is item details is not defined. So we want to pass item details, list ID and items as props to this. So let's do that, and there you go. Now we have these interactive components as well. So what happens when I delete this? Let's look at our network calls as well, and now let's hit delete. We are getting another error, ID is not defined. So let's see what is going on here. When I click delete, handle delete item, and then item.id. Okay, so I think let's console log item details and all the props first. Let's see what are we getting. So we have the ID inside item details. So let's take it from there instead of passing it as a prop. Okay, and now let's try hitting delete button. We open network tab, delete, and we are getting another error. Let's see what that is. Sorted items is not defined. Where do we need sorted items? Let's see that. So you see we have this function from the previous implementation, but we don't need this anymore. So we'll just get rid of this. Now let's try deleting, and there you go. Our API call is successful, but our UI is not getting updated. So we'll follow the same pattern here. I'll import use router here, and then in the delete, I'll do router dot refresh. Awesome. Now let's delete an item. There you go. Now our items are also getting deleted. Now we can delete items and also update the UI. The last thing that we want to work on is marking these items as purchased, and that itself should be pretty straightforward as well. Actually, so what we can do here is instead of having router.refresh inside handle delete item, we can move this to update item, because both handle delete item and handle check item are using this update item function. So I'll move it there, hit save, and let's see when I click on checkbox what happens. There you go, it's working as expected. Awesome, great. So now you saw how we took an app which was entirely server-side rendered, not using server components at all, and then integrating it with server components plus client or interactive components. And this is how your approach should be. Just take your whole app and break it down. Move all your interactive or client components to the leaves. So for example, what I did here is I moved these two buttons in its own components. I moved this share list to its own component. I moved this input along with this plus button in its own component. So the end result is when the client will initially load this app, now they don't have to see the loading screen. They will see all this data pre-rendered for them because we are using server components. And the best thing is we are making calls directly to the database in our server components, and we do not have to worry about all this code because this will not get shipped to the client. Next.js will render these on the server and then return that rendered part to the browser, and then this server component has a reference or link to the interactive components. What do I mean by that? So here we have interactive component here. So basically what will happen is it'll go generate a JS bundle for these, and then once the browser renders them, they'll eventually go refetch them and render it again. This is pretty much it. This was very basic of how React server components work. I'll be creating more videos on this concept, so make sure you come back to the channel to see those videos. Now, here is my take on React server components, whether you should use it or not. Now, the thing is, if you understand React server components in detail, you should go ahead and use those. But if you are learning React server components and you do not understand it a bit, there's no point using those. Just go move forward with server-side rendering and you will be fine. React server components give you a slight edge to the user experience, but if you think that they are making your app too complicated, it might not be worth it. So you might want to just stick to server-side rendering and you'll be fine. So in the nutshell, React server component are great but they are not mandatory. They are optional. If you like them, if you like making DB calls directly in your component, please go ahead and use those. If you don't, just stick to server-side rendering. And that's pretty much it. Thank you so much for watching. I'll be posting more videos on this, so make sure you come back to the channel for that. If you found this video helpful, please consider subscribing. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.